Into the 1900s, Cuba would become a de facto colony of America in all but name. Cuba was rich in resources, particularly sugarcane and cattle, and over time a large amount of these resources would come to be owned by US corporations. Cuba also became a hotbed of American alcohol running during Prohibition, and being so close and so beautiful, Cuba became a large tourist attraction to the American populace. The early 1900s were a politically tumultuous time for the new nation of Cuba. The Americans, reigning their de facto sovereignty on the island, would use its military to help quell various revolts during this time. In 1933, the Sergeant Fulgencio Bautista would come to power in a coup. Bautista would help propel American interest in Cuba, and help promote tourism to Americans, as Cuba became a favorite hotspot of American celebrities like Ernest Hemingway and Dean Martin. Bautista would also cozy up with the Italian mafia, and to American mobsters like Lucky Luciano, who turned Havana into a Caribbean casino paradise, a hotspot of gambling, drugs, and prostitution. Under Bautista, Cuba would participate alongside the Allies in World War II, where they played a key role in the Battle of the Caribbean, repelling German and Italian U-boats in the region. During this time, Luis Elizondo's father, Luis Elizondo III, was born in Cuba in 1940, under the Bautista regime. And here's Luis Elizondo's father speaking about his early life in Cuba during this time.
I was born in a bubble, in the sense that there were no real needs. I had clothes, I had food. If I needed shoes, there were shoes. We were not upper rich, super rich, but we had a good, comfortable life. My father was a professional and my uncle was a professional. They were doctors, they were in the professional business, and we were doing okay. And living in suspension, in that bubble, I really had no needs, no wants. Everything was taken care of. Big loving family, very honest, very principled, very intellectual.
Following the end of Bautista's term in 1944, Bautista would immigrate to the US for a few years, laying low, until he decided to run once again for president of Cuba in 1952. Facing certain defeat in this election, Bautista would once again instigate a military coup and take Cuba by force.
But Cuba's political freedom is ended as Bautista cancels the June 1st elections, as his soldiers patrol the streets to establish what he calls disciplined democracy.
This latest coup would be backed by the United States. Here we see then Senator Richard Nixon establishing diplomacy with Bautista after the coup. Bautista would suspend elections and use brutal methods to take out his political opponents. This coup led to some revolts, one in particular by a lawyer, Fidel Castro, who had ran in the election that was suspended by Bautista and felt this very unjust. Fidel Castro was jailed by Bautista after an attack on a military barracks following Bautista's coup. Bautista also put in place policies that saw a majority of the wealth generated in Cuba leave Cuba for foreign corporations, and a majority of the land to be owned by foreign entities. Bautista would also outlaw the Communist Party, a move that greatly pleased the Americans as the Cold War against the Soviet Union was now in full swing on a global level.
It came when my government stopped the Russians from using Cuba as an exchange point in their international spy system.
Bautista ruled with an iron fist, and his forcible taking of the election caused many Cubans to view him as a brutal dictator. And the elder Elizondo was soon at odds with his government.
And the crisis came when I realized that something was not working in society. And that set me in a course of conflict with my group. And so it happens that without even trying, I had to make a decision, and I did, that put me in conflict with the regime at the time, which was Bautista.
It is not the same to fight for liberty as to fight against it. All the people of the Sierra Maestra are with us. We have stopped the start of the revolution. We gladly suffer cold and rain and the hardship of life in the mountain. This is only the beginning. The last battle will be fought in the capital. You can be sure.
Luis Elizondo Sr. found the answer to the previous injustices in the dictator Bautista in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Cuba. Here, a rebel force had landed under the leadership of Fidel Castro. Fidel had been jailed years earlier for another coup attempt, but was released by Bautista in a show of good intentions. At that time, Fidel Castro fled to Mexico and made preparations to return to Cuba and overthrow Bautista. After training in Mexico, Castro returned to Cuba on a boat packed with 81 men, amongst them the Argentine Che Guevara, to take back Cuba from Bautista and from the Americans' proto-imperialism. Fidel offered the most promise in correcting the wrongs of Bautista, and the senior Elizondo would go out and join up with the rebels and begin training for combat.
Things happen and things go as they usually go, and there I was.
As a kid, I remember him telling me these stories. One day, if you have more time, you got to hear it. Stories of him training in the jungles of Cuba to overthrow Bautista, and the crazy, incredible stories that he was part of it.
Before long, the elder Elizondo was a combat-trained soldier, fighting with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara to overthrow the dictator Bautista. The campaign against Bautista lasted a couple of years. As time went on, Castro was growing more and more popular, and Bautista's power was dwindling. The revolution would officially end in January of 1959, when Bautista was forced to flee the country, and Fidel and the rebels took Havana.
Havana, often the mecca for gamblers, sees the jackpot payoff of a political longshot. Bearing 26th of July banners, joyous followers of Fidel Castro sweep triumphantly through the Cuban capital hours after their rebellion had toppled the regime of Fulgencio Bautista. Rebel fighters fresh from the battlefield in central Cuba pour into the capital to impose martial law and quell the rioting. Castro follows a more leisurely itinerary to Havana. When he began this campaign with a handful of men, he said, "I will be a hero or a martyr." At 31, he's very much a hero.
The elder Elizondo, like many Cubans, were happy about the outcome of their campaign, and had a lot of hope for the future of Cuba now that Bautista was out and Castro was in.
When the yards of the barracks would be full of cadavers, when our women were violated, when the children were murdered.
The revolution had won. The people that I felt sympathy for won. There were people that were fighting the same beast from a different column, for a different mountain, but there again, we had won.
But as time went on, the elder Elizondo grew disillusioned with Castro, who was getting closer and closer with the Soviet Union and the international communist movement. Castro went on to imprison and execute many of the old Bautista regime, but also many who had fought with him. Castro had also put limitations on freedom of speech, and Castro also seized property from native Cubans and American corporations in favor for left-leaning policies.
The cry in Havana is, Cuba, see? The Yankees, no. The trucks belong to the American-owned Cuban Electric Company, recently nationalized by the government, along with the telephone company, also American-owned. His latest blow against the United States, the seizure of $750 million of American-owned properties in Cuba.
The elder Elizondo would feel betrayed by the new regime he helped instill.
And it so happened that I had conflict with that system also when I didn't understood and it was not explained. I was politically naive at the time.
And then later on, Castro says, you know what, I'm going to go communist. And my father says, hey, that's not what we signed up for, Jack. You know, you said freedom. We want to be away from tyranny. And of course, Castro is looking at between the U.S. and Russia at the time, and makes a decision. He's going to side with one side, and the rest is history.
And I rejected them because what I consider was a betrayal of the revolution, which put me in conflict.
And he, like thousands of Cubans, would flee to Cuba for refuge in the United States. Once in America, Elizondo's thoughts weren't on establishing a new life in the States, but on returning to Cuba and removing Castro. Fortunately for Elizondo, there was a large contingent of Cubans in America who felt the same way, and the US was not happy with Castro seizing the lands owned by American businesses, and with a new hotbed of communism only 90 miles from its shores. The CIA would help form all of these anti-Castro Cuban exiles into Brigade 2506. Under the Eisenhower administration, the CIA would help organize and fund this new brigade with the intended goal of returning to Cuba and overthrowing Castro. All over Miami, there were enrollment centers for Brigade 2506.
This is Ron Oppen in Miami. I'm standing in one of the many anti-Castro recruiting places scattered throughout the city. Since 2 o'clock this morning, men and boys have been filing through this door behind me, anxious to join the fight in Cuba against Fidel Castro's government.
My father and mother are down there. That's all.
And this is exactly what Elizondo was looking for. Under CIA Chief Allen Dulles, CIA operative E. Howard Hunt would be one of the point men organizing these Cuban exiles. E. Howard Hunt has a long history with the CIA. He helped coordinate many Cold War regime changes, and he is who the smoking man from the X-Files is modeled after.
Ashamed? You're not allowed the luxury of human weakness and penitence. You're not allowed to put your indulgences ahead of the greater purpose.
Elizondo Sr. would join Brigade 2506 after arriving in America, beginning the Elizondo family's long relationship with American intelligence. The CIA spent millions of dollars arming and training this guerrilla brigade. They set up a camp in Guatemala for Brigade 2506 to train in. They were trained on military tactics, radio communications, sabotage, and a variety of other combat skills. Brigade 2506 was also gifted a small air force that would be used in the upcoming invasion. Intelligence reports indicated that there was growing discontent within Cuba with Castro, and there would be uprisings that would help Brigade 2506 once they landed. The site chosen for the invasion was on the southern coast of Cuba, about 70 miles southeast of Havana, and was named Cochinos Bay, better known as the Bay of Pigs, due to the aggressive pigs found in the area. The plan was for an initial airstrike to wipe out Castro's small air force. This was an integral part of the plan, as neutralizing Castro's air force was a necessity for the next part of the plan, which was an amphibious landing of around 1,500 Cuban expatriates. The Cuban invasion plan was coming together. There was one complication within this plan: the presidential election in November of 1960 and the transferring of power and oversight on the already set in motion operation. On the campaign trail, JFK was calling for tough policy regarding Cuba, which caused many Cuban exiles to support Kennedy, who thought he supported the removal of Castro.
The Democratic candidate for president is in New York campaigning. He issues a statement in which he says the United States is not doing enough for the Cuban exiles. He says the United States ought to help them.
Ironically, on the campaign trail, Nixon seemed softer on Cuba, even though as vice president, he had been aware of Eisenhower and the CIA's plan to retake Cuba.
Now, I don't know what Senator Kennedy suggests when he says that we should help those who oppose the Castro regime, both in Cuba and without. But I do know this, that if we were to follow that recommendation, that we would lose all of our friends in Latin America, we would probably be condemned in the United Nations, and we would not accomplish our objective. I know something else. It would be an open invitation for Mr. Khrushchev to come in.
Senator John Kennedy, incidentally a keen yachtsman, has been chosen as 34th President of the United States.
Senator John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon in the election of 1960. The invasion of Cuba was concocted under the Eisenhower administration, and the incoming Kennedy was briefed 10 days after the election on all the preparations that were already in motion, still unsure how exactly to manage this planned invasion that was thrown into his lap. The new President Kennedy would greenlight the Cuban operation, but made one thing clear: US forces were not to get involved with the fighting. This was a seemingly change of policy from the previous administration's views. Kennedy was concerned about upcoming UN talks regarding American aggression against Cuba, and overt US involvement would be bad optics for the US. The Cuban exiles, however, were unaware of Kennedy's sentiment, expecting full US support given Kennedy's tough-on-Cuba rhetoric on the campaign. The Cuban exiles of Brigade 2506 were all united in their hatred for Castro, and after months of training and preparations, it was finally time for Elizondo Sr. and the rest of Brigade 2506 to return to Cuba.
Miami, the first week of April 1961. Invasion fever is rising among the Cuban exiles. Everyone seems to know the invasion is coming soon.
The Bay of Pigs invasion was precipitated by a series of airstrikes against Castro's Air Force on April 15, 1961. Initial reports were that they hit a majority of their targets. Neutralizing Castro's Air Force was a necessity for the invasion. The invasion would have problems from the beginning. Brigade 2506's previous airstrikes didn't get all of Castro's jets, and Castro's jets destroyed the brigade's B-26s, which were supposed to provide air support to the brigade. 2 transports carrying medical supplies and ammunition exploded before they reached the shore. Elizondo Sr.'s own transport would also be hit, and Elizondo would have to swim to shore during the invasion.
You know, my father winds up going to Guatemala, training, and then coming on the USS Houston. A ship gets rocketed, swims to shore. They're under attack. There's no air support other than a couple CIA guys who decide to, by the way, for the record, disobey orders, and they decided not to abandon their brothers. And I've always said, that Cuba may have lost many of her sons that day, but she also lost a few of her brothers.
For the men that reached the shore, the intelligence reports were also wrong. It was supposed to be a dark landing beach, but the beaches were fully lit. There were also bad intelligence reports about the amount of Castro forces the brigade expected to face. Intelligence reports had indicated that they would face 5,000 Cuban forces on the beach, when in reality it was over 20,000 against the brigade's 1,500. And Fidel Castro himself would come and take personal command of the Cuban forces. Another failure was the supposed uprisings that were to arise. Castro had received advance word of the invasion, and anyone with any inkling of anti-Castro sentiment was jailed to prevent any potential uprisings during the invasion. Fighting lasted for a few days, but it was very meek and hopeless for Brigade 2506. The only hope would be direct American intervention, but that never came. Kennedy forbade it, a decision that caused many Cuban Americans to harbor disdain for the new president, who they felt backtracked from campaign promises.
No hope of help from within Cuba or from outside. At 3:45 p.m. Wednesday, April 19th, resistance ends. All those who are not killed are taken prisoners. In less than 72 hours, Castro has destroyed the brigade. The American planned, trained, and backed invasion of Cuba is now a total failure.
The Cuban forces would capture all of the rebels, Luis Elizondo's father among them.
There is despair and confusion among the relatives of the insurgents. In Miami, they besiege the headquarters of the Revolutionary Democratic Front, seeking some news of sons and brothers, with Castro claiming the capture of 500 invaders and threatening them all with the firing squad. These weeping women see no chance for their loved ones.
Es un símbolo para todos los pueblos oprimidos. Playa Girón es la primera derrota del imperialismo en América Latina, pero también es una de las primeras derrotas del imperialismo en escala mundial.
The Cuban forces would capture all of the rebels, Lou Elizondo's father among them. Elizondo would spend 2 years imprisoned in Castro's jails. He was tortured by the communists, something that Elizondo would say would permanently change him, and was even imprisoned during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the next major escalation between Cuba-US relations. After 2 years, Elizondo and some of the other men captured at the Bay of Pigs would be allowed to return home.
Gentlemen of the brigade, I need not tell you how happy I am to welcome you here to the United States.
Es un honor para mí el estar hoy entre un grupo de los hombres más valientes del mundo.
What a profound impression your conduct during some of the most difficult days and months that any free people have experienced.
Participar en la alegría que tienen que sentir los miembros de sus familias, quienes por tanto tiempo vivieron esperanzadas.
What a profound impression your conduct made upon not only the people of this country, but all the people of this hemisphere. Even in prison, you served in the strongest possible way the cause of freedom.
After 2 years of being imprisoned, Elizondo and a lot of his fellow combatants captured during the Bay of Pigs would be released and returned to America at a big ceremony at the Orange Bowl in which President Kennedy welcomed them home, hoping to win favor with the Cubans. Once stateside, the elder Elizondo still longed to remove Castro from power, now more emboldened by the years of torture he faced, and he would join the group Alpha 66.
This is Al Dempsey in Miami, just 5 minutes away from Miami Beach's lush multi-million-dollar hotels. Men are training to fight Fidel Castro's.
Alpha 66 was the spiritual successor to Brigade 2506. Alpha 66 was composed of anti-communist, anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and they would train and finalize operations against the Cuban state for years. The intelligence community would call on Alpha 66 for all kinds of nefarious operations, and even set up an infamous assassination team all centered around killing Fidel Castro. This assassination team would perform many assassinations around the world for the CIA, and they would be considered a terrorist organization in many countries.
The alliance between the CIA and the Cubans rears its head constantly throughout the latter part of the 20th century. So it's like a subterranean narrative that runs through the latter part of the 20th century. The CIA and right-wing elements in American politics using the Cuban Americans to do all kinds of dirty covert deeds. And we're talking about terrorist activity, assassination of an ambassador from Chile right in Washington, D.C., blew up his car because he was sympathetic to Castro. A bomb planted on a Cuban jetliner flying from Panama City to Havana. 73 people killed, innocent people, including the fencing team from Cuba, young people. The Watergate burglary. 5 out of 7 of the burglars were Cubans, Bay of Pigs veterans.
Really?
They had been recruited by a guy named E. Howard Hunt, CIA agent who was one of the orchestrators of the Bay of Pigs invasion. A dirty war was waged by the anti-Castro underground in combination, in partnership with the CIA. And so the CIA would come to these Cuban exiles, the militant exiles, and they'd say, go do this operation, go do this burglary at the Watergate, and then we go get Fidel. Go do this assassination, and then we go get Fidel. And the Cubans were always ready and willing.
There are even some who connect Alpha 66 to the assassination of JFK.
Oh, you'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin. This is from the United Press, from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital.
A flash from Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas.
Lee Harvey Oswald was being held as the alleged assassin.
I'm just a patsy.
President.
There is Lee Oswald.
He's been shot. He's been shot.
Now, there are a million theories about JFK that we can't get into too deep here, but people might not know how connected the Cuban exiles of Alpha 66 are to many of the prominent theories regarding the assassination. Alpha 66 founder Antonio Vaciana would claim Lee Harvey Oswald was seen with CIA officers days before the assassination.
He was associated with Maurice Bishop, and if Maurice Bishop was intelligence, he was working for the intelligence service in the United States, I don't doubt that he was working with him.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
Before he died, E. Howard Hunt, the CIA official who helped form Brigade 2506, would make a taped confession about knowledge of a conspiracy to kill Kennedy and name various Alpha 66 members in the plot, including Frank Sturgis, David Morales, and Antonio Vasiana. Here is who RFK Jr. says killed his uncle, JFK.
And we know who they were. You know, it was David Adley Phillips, it was Bill Harvey, it was E. Howard Hunt, it was Alan Dulles, it was James Jesus Angleton. We know the shooters. They were, three men from who had been in Bautista's battalions in Cuba.
An interesting tidbit related to Howard Hunt and a bunch of Cuban exiles of Alpha 66 being involved in the Watergate burglary was that Howard Hunt's lawyer at the time would later claim Howard Hunt told him JFK was taken out partially because of the UFO cover-up.
Well, why was John Kennedy assassinated? What would be in those reports that would be important? And he said, why was John Kennedy assassinated? He said John Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. About to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. And I was stunned by that. I mean, John Kennedy, our president, Soviets, and I never even heard about such a thing. And he said, and I said, well, what was that? And at that point, he leaned forward and looked right in my eyes, direct in my eyes, and he said, the alien presence.
I'm not saying Luis Elizondo's father was involved in the assassination of JFK, but he was involved with the CIA-backed Alpha 66. The torture he experienced in Castro's prisons instilled a lifelong hate in the elder Elizondo. Elizondo would continue to train in military tactics with Alpha 66 for years, hoping to return to Cuba and remove Castro. This is the world Luis Elizondo was born into in 1972. Lou's mom was from Kansas and was a Playboy bunny. She was of Persian, Native American, and Scottish descent, and Lou says she raised him Jewish. Elizondo was born in Texas, but the family would move to Florida when he was young, and the Alpha 66 life was ingrained into Elizondo from a young age by his father. Elizondo was born into a unique blend of American intelligence and counterinsurgency. Lou's father's involvement in Alpha 66 was not like other immigrant groups in America. From his birth, Lou Elizondo was expected to one day return and invade Cuba, and his upbringing reflected that. From an early age, Elizondo would partake in paramilitary training with his father in Alpha 66.
But I'll say it, I was raised with the understanding that one day we were going to go back and liberate Cuba.
Right.
That's the world I grew up in, Brigade 2506 and all of a sudden Alpha 66. And you've got, at 7 years old, you're learning how to disassemble an AK-47 and an M16. Not that that's bad or good. It's just, it is what it is. And, that day never came. I grew up in that environment. And, some of the political measures that we used to try to change the situation in Cuba didn't work.
Elizondo would claim that his childhood was robbed by his father's need for revenge. In his book, he writes, "While other kids my age read the Boy Scout handbook, I paged through books Dad had pressed into my hands, The Anarchist Cookbook, and How to Survive in Vietnam. In a previous life, my father and grandfather had both been skilled bomb makers, so Dad would take me and some of my friends out to a remote parking lot and teach us how to construct our own rocket launchers out of PVC pipes, explosives, and a 9-volt battery, or show us how to break into a house by levering a sliding door off its tracks with a screwdriver. Alpha 66 wasn't just some group that met for dinner twice a month. This was a militant group with the stated goals of violently taking back Cuba from Castro. And in many parts of the world, Alpha 66 is still considered a terrorist organization. Elizondo claims his father at one point owned an Italian restaurant that allowed him to finance his paramilitary ambitions, would have some interesting property sales and flips of vacant lots that could be connected to Alpha 66 efforts for raising money. And Lou Elizondo even claims in his book that the film director Brian De Palma consulted his father when working on Scarface.
You a communist? Huh? How do you like it? They tell you all the time what to do, what to think, what to feel. I'm Tony Montana, a political prisoner from Cuba. And I want my fucking human right. Now.
According to Elizondo, his father would have violent outbursts at the most inappropriate times, often making public callbacks to his own torture at the hands of Castro.
my brother.
It's harder and harder for them. Until we stop, they have to go to someplace else.
Lou Elizondo says as a child he was bullied, and that he lived in constant fear and paranoia of his bullies. Lou also says that when his father found out about his bullying, his father went to his PE teacher and threatened to murder him in front of all of his classmates for allowing it to happen. Lou's parents would get divorced when he was young. His father remained angry at Castro, and according to Lou, his mother would always have